I think the harvest value is, and these are estimates, but $800 an acre for for the thing,
Right.
for the oyster. The ecological services values, they vary wildly, I think, and that's a factor of where the reef is in the oyster. I mean, in the bay system.
Right.
So the ones on the shoreline are more valuable than the ones out in the open water because the ones on the shoreline provide more services.
Right.
And anyways, that number gets up to $20,000 per acre. I mean, it could be like $2,000 per acre, but it could also approach $20,000 an acre. And
All right, we're counting down. Another episode of the Skiff Wonder podcast. I'm joined today by Shane Bonnot.
you did it.
Did I do it right?
You did it right.
I was so new the whole drive over here. I was like, I'm going to say it wrong. I should just fly fish. I'm going to say it wrong. Out on this. We're going to talk a little bit about fly fishing. I got Shane out on the skiff yesterday. We did some. We took him out on his first redfish on fly.
Yeah.
And then we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the conservation issues facing the Texas coast. Shane, you're the director of advocacy for the CCA Texas, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, talk about growing up here in Texas and how you got into CCA.
Sure. So I did grow up in Texas, Wharton County. My father is a veterinarian, and my mom was a school teacher there in Wharton. There's four of us. I'm the second of four, older sister and two younger brothers, and did all the stuff that kids in a rural county do growing up, hunting and fishing and catching snakes and getting in trouble. Lots of stories of me getting in trouble as a child, probably worthy of another conversation, but had a lot of fun, had a really good childhood, got to do a lot of outdoor stuff and interacted a lot with older people as a result of my father's work. He'd take me out on calls to go pull a calf or to go do some emergency procedure on a large animal. So I got to go out and be out in the world. I wasn't confined and locked up playing video games and on the computer. I mean, we'd always be outside playing, and we had neighborhood friends playing sandlot ball, and we had a lot of fun growing up. So my family has a ranch in an adjacent county, Jackson County, and so we'd go out there and I'd help with cattle operations, and we'd deer hunt and dove hunt and waterfowl hunt. I mean, we lived the dream.
Yeah.
We were really blessed, and that property is still in the family, and still able to go out and do a lot of those things. So on the weekends, Dad would take us fishing when he wasn't on call. We weren't going to the ranch. We'd go to Matagorda Bay. And we didn't have a boat through most of my childhood. So my uncle, John Cosper, who was an extension agent for Wharton County, he knew a lot of landowners, and we would get access to bayfront property. And so we'd drive up and drive through the ranches and get to the shorelines, and then get out and walk and wade. And I mean, a good day was catching a few fish because you're limited to just that spot.
Right.
And so we do our best, and some days were great, and some days were good, and some days were just thankful to be out on the water situations. And so did a lot of that growing up. I mean, a lot of my memories revolved around fishing. So graduated college and went to college, and those two things, large animal vet practice and fishing, were like tugging at me.
Yeah.
And another thing tugging at me in college was not studying and staying out too late and making bad grades. So anyhow, I did apply for vet school, and I didn't get in because my grades were so bad, but I had an opportunity to pursue advanced degree. I mean, I could go off and get a master's and then go into vet school. That was kind of the route that the administrators told me that I could get in if I did that. And then the same time, I was hot and heavy with my girlfriend, who is now my wife, and she was going to Corpus Christi. And she said, "Hey, you love fishing. You love to do stuff on the water. They have this really cool program in Corpus Christi at A&M about marine science and aquaculture, which is, fish farming." And so that intrigued me. So I followed her to Corpus. I wasn't going to let her get away. And we went to Corpus, and I did my master's in Corpus Christi in mariculture and loved it.
Yeah.
I had a really good time there. And then, so did that. And we both graduated and got married. And my first job was moving off to Virginia with her. And I went on to manage the oyster hatchery there at Virginia Institute of Marine Science, which is a wonderful experience. And we had a great time and lots of fond memories of Virginia, which is just an awesome state. We wanted to start a family and came back here. And I started with Parks and Wildlife, Texas Parks and Wildlife. And I was always fond of Brazoria County, which is where Lake Jackson is, where I'm from now. And the opportunity to go back there and live there really intrigued me. So this job came up with the hatchery, Redfish hatchery in Lake Jackson at Sea Center, Texas. And I jumped on it, and we came home, and I stayed there for 10 years and started as a biologist, ended up being the hatchery manager. And that's when CCA approached me a couple of times, but they finally approached me with this advocacy director position. And it looked like just a wonderful opportunity to be engaged in just a broad spectrum of issues associated with fisheries, and the idea that I could be involved in that conversation of conservation, right, and trying to make things better and leave things better than we found them, just really pulled at my heartstrings. And so that's the long story of how I got to where I am.
Okay, yeah. And then
I may have wandered off too far, but there's a lot of things that happen in life, and then you look at where you are now and what you're doing, and you try to pull things out from your life and see it, who was steering you along to get to where you are now. Yeah. How did you get there? And so for me, those things that I think that did that were on the banks of Kerlansky Bay, fishing with my father and my uncle, and we were bait fishing, and there's a cork, and cork goes under, and I'm locked in. My knees are locked, and whatever's on the end of my line is pulling me out into Kerlansky Bay, sliding on the mud and the oyster shells. And I want to create that opportunity for a lot of people. And so right. I think about that specific moment a lot of times, and I wonder if there was something that happened within me at that moment that's got me to where what I'm doing now. Yeah. And so that's why I kind of elaborated on that.
No, there's definitely, I think, we talked a little bit on the Skiff yesterday, and I kind of had a similar, not similar, but similar moment of being outdoors and kind of realizing, hey, if there's a way I can present this to people and give them the opportunity or make them want to be out there. And it's cool to see, I've taken this approach of content creation, and you've gone into CCA and try to make more opportunities through conservation. And definitely glad that we can sit down and combine the two. So what I know you said you have a broad scope as the advocacy director with CCA. Can you kind of go in a little bit more into your role there and what Sure. you're doing?
Yeah. So we, my position's a little weird. I mean, I work for CCA Texas, but I also do a little bit of stuff for national.
All right. Sorry, we had some batteries die on us. You were talking about just the process for legislature and
the role as advocacy director. So fisheries management through Parks and Wildlife or through the legislature in Texas, or federal fisheries management through the Gulf Council. And then, that's a lot of what I do. I also get out and speak to the members, go into chapter meetings. I mean, we have 58, hope to soon have up to 60 chapters across Texas alone. And so they hold monthly or bi-monthly, or some of them just hold a couple of meetings a year. But the ones that are really engaged have monthly meetings every month, and they're bringing in guest speakers and talking to their members about what's important to them and what they want to see happen in their local region. So I'll go out occasionally and talk to the chapter members and get feedback from them or present a topic to them. And then, some of the work that we get involved in has to do with stuff like freshwater inflows and issues that revolve around the growing industrial complex in specific regions of Texas. I mean, we're in one now where you're just seeing this rapid growth and development with the petrochemical industries, and so there's conflicts that arise as a result of that, and so we have to be engaged in that conversation and in the process of deciding what's best for the coast. And although what you and I want may not ultimately be within the realm of reality,
right?
We still need to be in there and discussing what speaking for the resources. So
right.
we're involved in that as well.
Yeah, finding that kind of middle ground where we can all come to the table and walk away with maybe not excited, but at least feeling like we're heard. And that was honestly one of the, I think, if anybody listening to this ever has an opportunity to go to one of those hearings like we went to last night, I think they definitely should, and get a chance to see the process that a lot of these legislature rules go through. Because that's the second one that I've managed to make it to, and it's a really cool process just to see and to really see that voices get heard. I know some of people, they may not feel like their voices are quite heard, but they definitely are, and I like that. Even a rule change as simple as trout bag limits goes through the right process, and everybody gets a chance to speak to it. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what we were witnessing last night, what we were doing last night?
Yeah, okay. So last night we were in Corpus Christi at Texas A&M Corpus, and Parks and Wildlife was hosting a public hearing for some proposed rules that the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission is going to consider later this month, early 2022. And those rules are a response to the freeze event that happened February 2021, and it's a temporary measure to increase the spawning stock biomass of trout. So try to help the species recover from the freeze, because a lot of fish were lost in the freeze. And the specific regulations are a pretty tight slot size, 17 to 23 inches, and then a 3-fish bag limit, which is a 2-fish drop from the current 5-fish bag limit. Those would expire in August 31st, 2023. Give them 2 years to at this new regulation to try to get the stock back up, and it's going to take longer. Let me say this: it's in previous freeze events, there have been regulation changes. Afterwards, but they were permanent.
Right.
After each of those regulation changes, and I'm talking about 1983 and then the ones in 1989, after those regulation changes, it took 2 to 3 years for the catch rates in Parks and Wildlife gill nets
to come back right.
to that mean level. That does not mean it took 2 to 3 years for a bunch of 27-inch fish to start showing up. That takes
a long
7 to 8 years. So your catch rates get back up to where they were historically, but your size distribution takes longer.
Right. And that was, I know for me, it was cool to see them present the science, and you could really see, that they're not just coming out of left field with the regulations. They're really looking at the data and the trend lines and trying to make sure that the long-term impact from that freeze, we can recover quickly. Because I looking at it, my eyes, I definitely saw the drop, and I think it looked like they had a few places that they didn't expect to see it up in Matagorda Bay.
Yeah, there's a there was a really significant disconnect between what individuals were seeing immediately after the freeze.
Yeah.
Like people went out, a lot of people went out to go look at the damage and the devastation because they knew that fish were floating or fish were lethargic. So they went to go get videos and pictures and things like that. And they were reporting hundreds and hundreds, thousands of fish. And then the initial assessment came out that the department conducted, and those were two different things. Like they weren't connecting.
Yeah.
What the department was saying and what people were saying were not jiving. And so now the data from the gill nets does jive with what these guides and these anglers were seeing out on the water on the Middle Coast. And so the guides and the people that were reporting the kills are happy to see that the department is doing something now.
Yeah.
They wish that they were a part of that initial emergency ruling that the lower and the upper Laguna Madre received, which was a 180-day deal. They wish they were a part of that originally, but let's move on from that and get something done.
Yeah, no, like I said, it's cool. It's cool to be a part of that and see that process. And I know personally, it's something I want to take more and more, voice in and seeing firsthand.
Well, let me just highlight that point. It's important because I see this whether it's with state fisheries or federal fisheries. Like you need to be engaged in the process. Typing something on Facebook is not engaging in the process.
No.
Show up, speak to the managers that are making the decisions or the elected officials that are making the decisions, and present yourself in a respectful manner and articulate your position, and you'll be heard.
Yeah.
You might not get the answer you want, but you need to be a player on the field and not just a spectator.
If somebody listening to this wanted to become more involved, what are some good websites to kind of keep an eye on for those dates? Because I know the hearings, they're not like a set like every Tuesday. They kind of when they need them.
Good question. The best thing you can do if you want to talk specific to fisheries, parks and wildlife, you can actually sign up for email alerts.
Okay.
on their news releases and on their public meetings. You can go to their website and there's I don't know them off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I'll look at. I'll link it.
But you can sign up for those alerts, and then also, if you're interested in policy and laws, you can sign up each legislative session. You can sign up for alerts for when committees are meeting to talk about specific things. You can sign up for those alerts if you want to take a drive up to Austin and participate in that. So,
yeah.
But and then federal fisheries through the Gulf Council, Gulf of Mexico Fisheries Management Council, same situation. So,
okay.
And then the other thing is, join groups that speak for your cause, whether it's Galveston Bay Foundation or CCA or Flatsworthy or whomever, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, whatever you like to do, find a group that represents you and advocate through them.
Yeah.
So.
I know that, we talked a little bit beforehand about getting straight into fly fishing, but since we're into conservation, I think let's hit the big one.
Okay.
All right. So, Shane, you talked a little bit earlier about you spent some time in Virginia, managing the oyster hatchery up there, and right now Texas coast we're kind of faced with some major oyster issues, some major harvesting issues from commercial fishermen in our bay systems. The reefs, the oyster reefs are kind of getting decimated, and there's some changes that need to be made, and the science is starting to point more and more towards those changes. I would like to start talking about this with kind of talking about oysters as a whole throughout the U.S., which if you feel comfortable speaking to that, and then, definitely narrow down. And so we can kind of see, what's happened in the past, say in New York or Apalachicola or even Virginia where you were at. And then we can kind of narrow that back into what's going on with Texas and where Texas is at. Because I've heard you say it and I've seen it, this is kind of, we're repeating ourselves. And I just want everyone listening to this to kind of see like where we're at in this process and where we need to go from here to try to avoid ending up like, Long Island Sound or someplace like that.
Okay. I'm going to do my best. I can speak a little bit more to Virginia than I can to other states, but you're right. I mean, the theme is the same. You have over exploitation of a limited resource that is pressured by other external forces, whether that be pollution or lack of rain or too much rain or storm surge with sediment covering them up. But throughout our small narrow window of what we know about oysters through our experiences with them, as we discovered this species, as when we came across the ocean and walked along the shorelines and could see these things that you could just pluck out of the water and eat, we realized that there's something to this. And Native Americans figured this out a long time ago. But we have a history of not paying attention to nature, and so in New York, a really good book to read about New York Harbor is a book called The Big Oyster by Mark Kerlansky, and he goes through the history of that harbor and oysters and man's relationship and the struggle that they've had, and more recently there's efforts underway to get the oysters back in the harbor. They have the Billion Oyster March, which is an effort to, through a hatchery program, through stock enhancement, to put oyster spat on shell and put that shell back out into the water to start the reefs over. Now they'll never be able to eat them because the water is so polluted. Yeah, it's not safe for human consumption, but it'll still do all of the fun stuff that oysters do in the water, all the ecosystem services they provide. And so back down the coast to Virginia, you see the decline in New England and New York, and move down to the mid-Atlantic, and then the decline starts there. And Virginia's fishery and Maryland and New Jersey, Delaware Bay, all those were robust fisheries, pristine estuaries, and just the same situation: over-harvest, pollution, excess runoff, siltation. Those things happened again, and when I went to Virginia, that whole program through Virginia Institute of Marine Science, the Aquaculture Genetics and Breeding Technology Center, that was the effort that the state had to help the industry rebound through creating brood stock that could be disease resistant, and then brood stock that would grow fast and help farmers have a product. So in that job, we selected traits for oysters and then bred those selected traits together to try to create an oyster that could grow fast and provide something for industry. So now, that state is rebounding. Not just that state, that region is rebounding. A lot of restoration efforts have gone into the Chesapeake, and then they have accepted and have really capitalized on things like oyster farming, growing oysters in cages, using a hatchery system to provide the seed, and then growing that seed out through a nursery, and then finally out in the water, open bay with cages. And so that's been well accepted in that area, and it's doing well. And then even the native reefs are coming back through as a result of decreased pressure and recognition and creation of sanctuary reefs, and just having enough seed oyster larvae released back out into the water to set on whatever structure is out there. So it takes a long time, but that process is beginning, and that fishery is starting to rebound. And then you mentioned Apalachicola. I think that bay has reverted to tong only. Using, like wooden tongs, so hand tonging only in that area. So because again, just too much harvest pressure.
Yep.
And I think there becomes a tipping point for the oyster fishery, and you never want to go beyond this point, and the fact that you become seed limited. Like, you don't have enough oyster larvae in the water to set on whatever structure is out there, hopefully oyster shells. And when you become seed limited, you have problems, and that's when you have to look at incorporating hatcheries and doing large scale restoration efforts. And so you see these things, and you just look and you read about what other states have gone through and the decline of oysters across other regions. It's the same species. All the way from Mexico up to Massachusetts, it's the same oyster. So what we have to do is look at what other states have gone through and the struggles that they've had, and realize that what's happening now here in Texas can't sustain. It is not sustainable. And we can go into reasons why that is, specific reasons if you want. But the basic situation we're in is too many boats and not enough oysters.
Right.
And there's reasons why that happened. And I think we have a really great opportunity in front of us to, while we still have seed in the water, we still have plenty of oyster larvae in the water for the most part. We have an opportunity to shift the industry off the public reefs, maybe not entirely, but some portion of shift off the public reefs, and create a network of sanctuary reefs so that the bays stay fully seeded with oyster larvae, and then opportunities for conservation groups to continue to actively engage in restoration, but make that effort have a really ease of entry, and really capitalize on this concept of leasing the bay bottom. So we want to do bay bottom leases to where we could enter into an agreement with the state and have designated areas for restoration, and those areas would never be opened to harvest.
Okay.
And so let me just go through the list of things.
Let's dig into let's definitely talk a little bit before we dig into it, just so people have a better understanding of kind of the life cycle of oysters. And then, I know, like, I'm actually, this is something I'm curious about, like some of these reefs out here, like if like a general time frame on like how long, to build those up, because I know that doesn't happen quickly.
Yeah, it's a good place to start. Yeah, so oysters live, like I said, they live about 10 to 12 years and start spawning their first year. They typically spawn as males. They're usually males their first year. It takes a lot less energy to be a male than it does to be a female. After that first year, they can be male or female, and sometimes they switch from one to the other. Again, it takes a lot more energy reserves to create an egg than it does to have sperm. So that's just a real generalized way of putting it. But they grow. They take nutrients from the water, and put that energy either into growth and putting calcium into their shell or spawning. And so they're filter feeders. They take phytoplankton and suspended particles out of the water column, and they'll filter them out. They can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. Each individual oyster can do that. And then what they're releasing is a little bit cleaner than what they took in. And so they're vital to the bay system's ecology, and they help create a healthier ecosystem. So as these reefs, when the oyster spawns, it releases eggs or it releases sperm, and those exchange in the water column. So fertilization of the egg happens in the water column, and that egg will develop quite rapidly, and it forms a larvae, a veliger, and so it's this little guy, it's got some cilia sticking out, and it's just like trying to swim along, but really it's kind of just being rolled around with the currents. And so it'll remain in that larvae form, and it grows, and it has a shell, but it's real soft, and it's very, very thin. And so it's swimming around in the water column, feeding for 2 to 3 weeks, and after that point, it starts to develop an eye spot, which is negatively phototactic. So it knows how to orientate itself to set on something.
Okay.
So when that happens, right before that happens, it has a little foot that it puts out, and it's this little thing so that it falls out of the water column, and it can kind of just scoot itself along to find a place to set. And so it looks for, it knows how to orientate itself, and it finds a place to set. And so it'll actually, physically attach to something,
right?
Hopefully another oyster shell. And then it's stuck there for the rest of its life, and it'll grow. And, oysters can get quite large, larger than our hands if you let them, if they get to that 12-year mark. But as that oyster grows, it grows probably next to another oyster on an oyster reef, and then subsequent generations are attaching to them.
Right.
And so that happens over years and years and years, and the reef gets bigger and bigger. And the ones at the bottom eventually get choked out, or they something else happens. They get disease, or they die from old age. But the reef continues to grow, and that shell's still there, and it's bound together still with all of these other shells. Even though the oyster's dead, it's still a part of that network. And it takes decades for reefs to build
as big
up.
As some of the ones in these bays are.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the only bay system in Texas that we have as a reference is Sabine Lake.
Mm-hmm.
There's a deep water oyster reef in Sabine Lake, and CCA and other groups have been involved in doing restoration projects around that reef. But that reef has a 5-foot vertical relief.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so from the top of the reef to the bay bottom and the areas around the reef, there's like a 5 to 6 foot difference. And so that tells me that reef has built up. It hasn't that system hasn't been harvested in like 50 years on on the Texas side of Sabine Lake. And so, it's hasn't been touched for decades, and it has a 5 to 6 foot vertical relief. So it takes a long time. A long time. Now, oysters are resilient in that you can reseed the top layer of a reef very quickly. At 1 to 2 years, and you'll have, let's say you harvest a reef and you scrape all of the keeper size oysters off of that.
Yeah.
Well, it'll only take 2 to 3 years for the new generation to set on there and grow and become keeper size. The issue is that, when you dredge these reefs and you scatter these oysters out, you keep dropping the relief.
Right.
The height of that reef continues to decrease, and you scatter the oysters out, and then they become more vulnerable to being covered up
By silt.
Silt.
Right.
Yeah. So, that's one of the things that we had pointed to in this letter that we submitted to Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, is to have some sort of metric that recognizes the importance of vertical relief,
right,
so that they don't become vulnerable to being silted over, which is what happened in Galveston Bay during the Hurricane Ike.
Yeah.
Most of our fishery was supported by Galveston Bay. Not all, but most of the oyster activity came from that region. And we lost those reefs during that storm event, and then all the pressure shifted down here.
Yeah.
And so now we're seeing, these guys here that live in this area, Rockport, Fulton, Aransas Pass, guys in Matagorda, they've seen it too, in that reefs that they used to be able to get out on and wade, or reefs that used to be able to provide sanctuary for shorebirds at low tides, they're no longer, they're not there, or they've just dropped down to a point. So I used to be able to wade a reef that was waist high. Now it's, I'm at my chest. And so that situation's just kind of repeating itself. And that's why we're saying, we have an opportunity now to do something. Let's capitalize on it.
I need to, I'm going to link in the down below in the show notes, the podcast that you did with, I'm going to forget their name, McLeod and
Scott McLeod,
yeah.
Michael Weiss, Mike Weiss.
Yeah. Because that was a great, hearing their insight, those are two guys that have spent their life watching these oyster reefs and just listening to their insight as to what's going on out there. Just kind of mind blowing. But yeah, definitely gonna. If you're listening to this and you want to listen to some more, listen to Shane's podcast that he does on this, because it's really good. It's really insightful.
Those guys are great.
Yeah,
two retired game wardens, and they've spent a lot of time on the water, especially Scott McLeod, because he stayed in this area for all of his 30 years as a game warden. He stayed along the Middle Coast, and he's seen it.
Yeah,
and he's been frustrated with it, but never really had the opportunity to participate in trying to make it better, or at least he wasn't heard.
Right.
And they're both trying to make change, as are a number of other people and organizations.
Because it seems, from what I've seen and read, it seems like basically what's going on right now is as the scientists are out there and they're taking, they're dredging the reef themselves to look at the size of the oysters to make sure that there's enough oysters on these reefs to harvest. And as they realize these reefs aren't harvestable anymore, they're shutting them down. And as they shut these reefs down, the oyster boats congregate on what little areas are still open, and then those areas are just rapidly getting 100, 150 plus boats on them in a day.
Yeah,
it's not good.
So in 2019, there were close to 400 boats counted in Seadrift, Texas. 400, and a lot of the workers that are on these boats aren't staying in hotel rooms.
Right.
They're living on the boats.
Right.
And so that's a significant, I would say, strain on that local area of body of water.
Right.
So the problem, you're right, the problem is these boats get concentrated into these areas because bay systems are closed, and it goes back to too many boats, not enough oysters. But the reasons there's too many boats is because there was a moratorium put on oyster licenses. So they said, okay, we're not going to sell, they passed a law that said, we're not going to sell any more oyster licenses. This is it. This is all that there's going to be. If you have one now, great. If you want to get one later, sorry. As that law was being made, there was lobbying done by the oyster industry to set a delayed window of when that closure date would be. So during that time, a lot of oyster licenses were bought prior to that deadline. Instead of cutting it off immediately, they gave them an opportunity
to just go out and buy as many as they could afford.
A significant more number of oyster licenses were bought, but they just sat there. They weren't being fished back when the moratorium was put in place. And I think that was maybe 2007. I could be wrong on that year, but somewhere in that time frame. And so those licenses, were just tabled. They were just sitting there. I mean, they would be renewed, but they weren't actively fishing. So from 2007 to today, there's been a series of oyster sack limit changes, number of oyster sacks that a harvester could harvest in a day. As those sack limits have gone down, they've just put more boats in the water.
Right.
So the pressure on the resource has sustained. The visual pressure on the resource, in my mind, has increased because you just see so many more boats out there than you did in the past. But the pressure is the same, and we're seeing the same things that we've done in, like I said, in Galveston Bay and other areas. We're degrading these reefs, and we need to do something so that we don't get to that tipping point that we spoke of earlier.
Yeah, and I want to, before we get into kind of solutions, can you talk a little bit about, let's start with the ecosystem, the environmental impact, so kind of the ecosystem around the oyster reefs. Because one of the things that, as I've gotten more and more into fly fishing and redfish, and I read about, you read about marsh, you read about the different ecosystems that you can look for redfish in, and one of the ecosystems that's normally mentioned is oyster reefs. They're not mentioned as like, oh, here's a food source. It's like, here is a habitat to look for redfish on. So if you could speak a little bit to kind of how the environmental impact of losing those oyster reefs, and then the economical impact of losing those oyster reefs. Because I know there's the dollar amounts are it's not good.
There's a lot that you could attribute economically to oysters, whether it's through ecosystem services or recreational opportunities. It's far more valuable if you look at it in those terms as opposed to oyster harvest. And so we do have some information on our website and some memes on our website that articulate those values. I think the harvest value is, and these are estimates, but $800 an acre for for the oyster. The ecological services values, they vary wildly, I think, and that's a factor of where the reef is in the oyster, in the bay system.
Right.
So the ones on the shoreline are more valuable than the ones out in the open water because the ones on the shoreline provide more services.
Right.
And anyways, that number gets up to $20,000 per acre. I mean, it could be like $2,000 per acre, but it could also approach $20,000 an acre. And then the recreational value, I don't remember the specific number, but it's in that $20,000 range, I believe.
I think that's what I remember, somewhere around there.
And so oysters do all these ecosystem services for the bay system. And we talked about filtering the water, but they also break up wave action as it goes across the bay, and which helps protect your shorelines.
Right.
It also helps more sunlight penetrate the water column, so that benefits seagrass. They sequester carbon. They take carbon out and capture it. And so, that's a real neat way to, you may start to see more interest in that. I mean, that's a conversation that's being had as it relates to carbon capture.
Right.
And getting industry support on whether it be restoration or getting industry support on the mariculture notion. And then, the habitat component of it is that they provide refuge or food or habitat for 303 aquatic species, different aquatic species. So, I mean, it's a coral reef.
Yeah.
It's a coral reef in our
Right.
bay system. There's really not much difference. And if you look at the values that those things add to those respective areas, they're kind of the same. One's prettier than the other, but they're the same thing. And so redfish in particular, well, not in particular, sheep's head, black drum, and redfish, they're attracted to these areas because of what they provide for food sources. So they're in there trying to nibble at crustaceans.
Right.
Sheep's head are in there picking stuff off of the oyster shells. Sheep's head are fascinating. I
Yeah.
know they're difficult to get on a fly, but
It's a Texas permit.
I've really fallen in love with that fish. It's an awesome fish. It is the swine of the sea. That's what I call it, because it eats anything.
Yeah.
And
It's got some great teeth for eating anything.
Some great teeth. Yeah, those are cool fish.
Yeah.
Anyhow, redfish are attracted to these areas because of what they provide for food source, and other fishes are attracted to those areas for the same reasons. And so you just have this whole network of fishes trying to capitalize on what's there. And you mentioned marsh habitat, and marsh habitat is valuable, as is the shore seagrass is valuable. But oyster reefs, when you put a value on them, the amount of aquatic biomass that they have is 4.5 times greater than the biomass found in seagrass. And the biomass on an oyster reef is like 11.5 times the biomass found on that cordgrass fringe area. So they just hold a lot more organisms than these other areas, but we don't tend to give them the same amount of respect as we do those other areas.
They're not as pretty.
They're not as pretty.
It's probably their issue.
And you can't, for a lot of times, you can't see them. I mean, they're underwater. Everything's happening out of sight. So if it's out of sight, it's out of mind.
Right. No, and then so let's go into a little bit kind of what measures are being proposed.
Yeah, and so we've proposed several. We've suggested several actions that we thought the department should consider, and I say we. It's several conservation organizations. I'll list a couple, but I'm going to miss some. And then also there's others that are submitting their own letters expressing similar concerns, but they may not have agreed with every single thing that we had in ours, which is fine. I mean, we all want the same thing. We just have different ideas of how to get there, I think that's wonderful. CCA Texas, Flatsworthy, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Matagorda Bay Foundation, Galveston Bay Foundation, International Crane Foundation, and there's a number of others that are on there. We had several freshwater fishing organizations jump in as well, because they're ahead of us typically on the coast with regards to conservation, but they know the value of habitat, and so they jumped in on the letter. And so it's available on CCA Texas's website, and you can see on there what we recommended, and that was this concept of expanding a lease program, both for conservation groups and for the commercial industry. So set aside conservation leases and set aside commercial leases. For this lease concept, commercial leases would be in locations that were where reefs used to be, or where there's still structure there for a base or a bottom where they could reestablish a lease, and in areas that would be productive for oyster growth. Right salinities, right freshwater inputs, all those things, that environmental factors that you'd want for oyster production. And, you could do the same thing for the conservation leases. Let's put them in spots where we know that oysters will grow, where a reef restoration project would work. Whether that be the commercial or the conservation lease, they would have exclusive rights to those areas, meaning if it was a conservation lease, it would not be open to public harvest.
Okay.
It would be closed off to harvest. And it would just be there to do all the ecosystem services. Of course, anglers could fish over them and fish on them, whatever. But we want those oysters to stay in the water. The commercial lease would be harvestable, but only to the leaseholder. They're going to be the ones putting the shell out and putting the substrate out there to recruit oyster spat. So they would have exclusive rights for the term of the lease.
And now they're invested in
it. So we have a small portion of this in Galveston Bay, like 2,300 acres or something like that, are leased. We want that concept expanded. Louisiana has tens of thousands of acres of oyster leases. And several of the companies in Texas, in Galveston specifically, hold a lot of acres of leases in Louisiana as well. So they know the program.
Yeah.
They know how this works.
Yeah.
We just need to get their buy-in on expanding that. We want their buy-in, I should say. And expand that across the Texas coast to relieve pressure on our public reef system. The other thing we asked them to do was develop that sanctuary reef network and identify spots to where you would close off reefs that are in the public reef system from harvest and let them do, again, all those things that they do in the water column, and hopefully serve as a seed source for adjacent public reefs. And then we asked them to recognize that vertical relief component of the reefs and include that as a metric in their management of opening and closing bay systems.
Yeah.
And then that's to address that whole siltation problem with public reefs. So those were the main things that we asked for in that letter. And again, there's other groups that are sending their own letters that may ask for something different or may ask for things in their own way. There is some concern from other groups about the socioeconomic impacts of taking away some of the public reef system or creating a commercial lease system and what that's going to have on some of the smaller players in the oyster industry. They don't know that they have the financial resources to participate in a commercial lease. And then there's worried about, there's some concern about if you take away some of the public reefs from harvest, then that's just less opportunity for them. And that's something the department will have to talk about and consider. And, from our point, it's like what's best for the ecosystem.
Right. So we have long-term oyster harvest. And then the another thing that I think it's starting to get fired up on the Texas coast a little bit is oyster farming. And there's already, I think, two farms.
Two farms that I know of that have been fully permitted and they actually have oysters in the water. There's one in Copano Bay and one in Galveston Bay. And from what I've gathered, there's been quite a bit of just lack of belief that can work.
Even though
it works, and it's been proven to work in other states. I've talked to several oyster industry people, commercial fishermen, and I'm surprised at just their lack of belief. I just, it's a little frustrating. But we helped create that law that allowed this to happen. Yeah. So that was passed in 2019. And so now we can have oyster farming in Texas. You can apply for a permit, and you can have an off-bottom lease. And the permitting process takes a little while. I mean, you might be looking at 9 months to a year to go through all of the permitting process. But you can lease areas. You select an area, and it has to go kind of through a vetting process. The user conflicts have to be addressed. Hopefully, you don't want any.
Right.
Can't be near an oil and gas well or off of a property owner's shoreline, and they don't want to have to look at this all the time. So you have to think about those things in your permitting. But yeah, you can permit for an off-bottom lease and grow oysters in cages, and it does work. And the tricky thing about oyster mariculture, or the thing that really needs to happen for the success of mariculture in Texas, is we need a hatchery system.
Yeah.
or at least a hatchery, to supply seed, small oysters to the farmers. And right now they're outsourcing to other states, and Parks and Wildlife is allowing that, but they have set a deadline of when they're not going to allow that any longer. And that deadline could change through another rulemaking. But right now, where the deadline's at, I think we have 5 years left to get a hatchery system in Texas, and that's where I see that effort needs to be put. So somebody in the private industry hopefully will step up and start doing that.
Yeah. That's what my next question was going to be, is if there is anyone already trying to get a hatchery going along the Texas coast.
There is, and it's the Palacios Marine Agriculture Research Organization. They are it's an ARO, Agriculture Research Organization, under the Ed Rochelle Foundation, which is kind of out of the Corpus area.
Okay.
And so they Dr. Joe Fox is heading that up, and they've pulled in some people from the Heart Research Institute, and so they have a hatchery manager, they have a director of research, and they have some staff, and they're breaking ground to build a hatchery in Palacios.
Okay.
But they're kind of a unique thing. I think their hope is to be kind of like a public-private situation, which is great. I just, if that's that place, I'd see it more as a teaching and educational center and showing people how to participate in the industry, and maybe eventually doing some of the things that are similar to what I was doing at VIMS, and working out the genetics and the breeding of broodstock. I think as far as mass production of seed for a future industry, that you'd want to look to private.
Yeah. It's just going to take time. I mean, I think so those first farms, that'll probably be 2 or 3 years before they're ready to harvest.
No, I mean, we can get, sooner.
Sooner?
Yeah.
So, I mean, and I might be a little off here, but to me, it seems like once those first harvests start coming in, it's going to really kind of, people will start to be like, oh, okay, this is possible. And then I think that'll hopefully help get the ball rolling a little quicker on establishing a nursery.
Consumers can drive this a lot quicker than the industry can.
Yeah.
If the consumers at the restaurants, at the half shell markets, demand a farmed oyster because it looks better. If you're talking about half shell and eating half shell oysters, it has a better presentation on the plate, and it's cleaner. The shell's cleaner. And so Brad Lomax with Water Street Restaurant in Corpus Christi is the guy in Copano Bay that has oysters in the water. And so, he's looking at providing oysters for his family's restaurant there at Water Street. They go through 600,000 oysters a year, half shell oysters. So he wants to do his own.
Yeah.
And that's how it can start, and people go there and see the oysters that he offers, as opposed to the place next door that's having to provide oysters from public reefs.
Right.
I mean, they look different. And they couldn't taste the same, but it just depends on where they're grown.
Right.
What bay system they come from. I mean, they really do. It's like inhaling the essence of the sea. It's wherever the oyster's grown.
Yep.
It's going to encapsulate that.
No, that's what I've always liked, when you get to try oysters from different places, because you definitely can kind of taste, that place in those oysters.
Yeah, and
there's always kind of cool.
Always an argument over who has the best oysters, who tastes the best. But it's fun, these guys that get into farming can really do some neat things with marketing and capitalizing on where their farms are.
Yeah. No, it's definitely, you drive across some of these bay bridges and you see the oyster fleets out there, and it's heartbreaking, but once I think you get a chance to really dig into what's going on, I think the future for the oyster and for the bays, I think, we're trying to move in the right direction, which is all we really can do, is keep trying to right our wrongs before we get ourselves into too much trouble.
Yeah, and it's some things will happen quicker than others.
Right.
and it's important, I think, that people stay engaged for the long haul. You might see like an area that you care about become protected, or you might see something happen that Parks and Wildlife does and you're happy with, and you're like, okay, good, that's over. But you know, the long conversation is get us to a point to where we can have oysters year round,
right?
And we're, you know, because I assume you love oysters. I love eating oysters, and I hate the fact that we have to close the oyster season because there's not enough left to harvest, and we're having to close. I mean, I like that we're doing it for sustainability reasons. Do not get me wrong, but I hate the fact that there's just not enough out there.
Right, that we've gotten to the point that we have to close it.
Yeah. So we want to create more opportunities and have more oysters at the restaurants.
Yeah. I lost track of what I was going to say.
No, it's fine. Have you been to some of those oyster bars to where, you know, it's a whole menu? It's like it's like a wine bar. You just pick and choose what region you want, where you want them from. Alabama's done a really good job with moving to oyster farming. Yeah. In recent history, Florida has a fairly robust oyster farming program, a really good clam program. Yeah. And then on up the East Coast, they're ahead of us. Yeah. Because they saw the declines before us.
Right.
So.
No, and it's kind of, I mean, and that's been, it seems like one of the things I've heard with the area here is there's been a lot of influx of out-of-state harvest, like people coming in from out-of-state and harvesting, and then the oysters kind of leaving the area where we lose, and that's, you know, kind of expedited the oyster reef degradation. Is a lot of the oyster shell doesn't make it back where it's supposed to go.
Right. So those outside boats, out-of-state boats, you know, that goes back to that whole available license situation I spoke to earlier. They'll assign that license to one of those vessels. So, yes, they're out-of-state boats, but you likely have in-state players helping get those guys here to harvest the oysters. Yeah. And then, well, dang, I forgot. I lost where I was. But anyways, we want more oysters. Like, if you had to boil it down, the whole conversation down to 2 words: more oysters.
More oysters. We want more oysters.
More oysters.
Because more oysters helps with more redfish.
Yes.
Even though we went fishing yesterday, shot an episode of the Rough Log, which I'm really excited. I went through the footage a little bit last night, and I'm excited to put that one together.
Oh, God. I can't. Yeah. Good thing I'm not afraid to embarrass myself, because there'll be plenty of embarrassing footage on that thing.
But we snuck out. Shane, you'd caught speckled trout on fly.
One speckled trout. That was my second time fly fishing. Yeah.
And I think that was my first time putting somebody on the bow that with your experience level. So I was nervous. Really? I was really nervous too. Because I didn't know that. How am I going to do this? Luckily, the redfish, I think they got the memo, and they were everywhere. I couldn't even tell you how many we saw. We saw so many. And then they were just some of the happiest redfish that I've seen in a long time. We had some wind out of the north. Nice. I mean, it really wasn't too bad of a wind, and then just bluebird, beautiful conditions.
I thought it was windy, like, for a first time learning how to fly fish. I was like, this is really windy.
Oh boy. No, so when I first got here, I think I told you when I first got here, one of the one of the guys in the fly shop in Corpus told me, he said, if you can successfully fly fish consistently on the Texas coast, you can go anywhere. And it's because of the wind. So that, like yesterday's wind, I mean, it was probably 15 to 20, especially when we got out away from some of the protection.
Yeah.
Which is normal.
That's normal. Corpus has 15-mile-an-hour winds 275 days a year.
That's normal.
That is normal.
So, but talk a little bit about that first fish and that first experience with that redfish.
Yeah. Well, first of all, and I told you last night, but thank you.
Yeah.
And to have a coach behind me through what, like I said, it was my second time and not comfortable at all up there. And it was funny, my confidence just came in waves like throughout the day. And I thought about this last night before I went to bed. And there was a couple of times I felt really good casting, and we'd see a fish, and I was thinking I could reach it or put the fly in the right place. And then other times it's just like, oh God, what am I doing?
That doesn't. I haven't got rid of that. Okay. By the way. Okay.
But to have you back there and then stopping and resetting and say, okay, you're doing this, you need to try to do this, or adjusting, making adjustments for me was invaluable, and really appreciated that. The first red on the fly, it felt like, it was an entire new feeling.
Yeah.
Catching that fish, and I felt everything. It was every little movement he made in the water. I had it in my hand. I felt it happening, and it's just different than conventional tackle, and having the reel and the tackle absorb so much of that activity. Yeah. I was in control or not in control.
Yeah.
Just depending. Yeah. And so it was, it's going to be a game changer for me, or a life changer. And I'm not going to say that I'm going to go 100% all in fly fishing every time. I will still, I have kids, so we're going to go soak some bait every now and then. But, for me, when we're going out across the Aransas and everybody's loading up, Dad and my brother loading up their bait casters, I'm throwing in the fly reel, and just for that day, just commit to it like we did yesterday. And I want to jump in. It's an intimate experience, and it's something that I want, after that first one, I wanted to do it again and again and again. And it didn't matter the size of the fish for me right at this point in my fly fishing career.
I haven't got there. I still like 16-inch redfish.
Yeah.
I think one of the coolest eats that we had was probably a 17, somewhere in that range.
I think that maybe it was the last one. Mm-hmm. It was, you had swapped flies, and watching that fish turn around and come get it was
eyes out of the water.
Yeah, that was cool. It was just awesome experience. A long ways to go, and I'm glad I finally got my feet wet and jumped in. It's an intimidating, for me, it was an intimidating thing to try to do and get into. I was much more comfortable, like I told you, jumping into archery than I was this. And I don't know why, but maybe it's because I'm older now than I was when I jumped into archery. And so anyways, it was awesome.
No, like when I really got into it, the first couple of times I went out on the water, I would put a spinning reel in, and be, just in case. And then finally I was like, I gotta just fully commit. I gotta just fully commit. And it is, I'll tell you right now, I'll warn you, as you get into it, the first year or so, like, it's gonna be a little frustrating. That yesterday was one of the most, I cannot really think of many days where we've just never stopped seeing redfish like that. I think we went to 2 spots, and both of them, we're constantly in them all day. And yeah, I still have those days where it's like, what am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing anymore.
If you had an accomplished person in the bow of that boat yesterday, you would have had, I don't know, 20 fish in the water, in the boat, to the boat.
We
Maybe
probably would have gotten too excited and started blowing shots. There was a few times where I was like, yeah, I probably would have messed that up too. Because I mean, you see, especially like, you know, some of those back areas where you get super skinny, you're in like inches of water. The boat's basically maybe has an inch of water underneath it, and you got that redfish coming at you, and you're like, oh, this is easy. And then just for whatever reason, maybe the wind gusts, maybe you just get in your own head, and those are like the I think I said it to you yesterday, like there's no layups. When you think you have a layup, something goes wrong, and it's just
as bad as I am at the front of the boat, I'm much better up there than I am at the back of the boat. Oh God, I thought I had that in the bag, and then just my brain was not working the right way. Like I was doing the opposite moves to try to turn the boat. Anyways, that was even more embarrassing than my casting. So.
Hey, you still put me on one.
No, I think we were actually just sitting on the bank.
We were spinning.
We were spinning.
We did that. We were spinning.
I'm really good at the 360.
Yeah, no, we were spinning. I was like, because I watched it last night. It's just the boat spins, and then I'm like, oh man, I'm so sorry. It's all right. Throw the cast out, and yeah. That was one of those, for whatever reason. Every now and then I have moments of just grandeur where I just somehow manage to just look really good in front of somebody. But I can tell you, we went out, we were down fishing and camping down south, and Shane, I think I blew I gotta look through it still, but I blew at least 30 shots just in a row within like the same time period. So it's, you know, you just get in your own head, and I think, like you said, and I'm glad it was helpful, and it's something I probably need to start doing more of with just myself, of just take a break, take a breather, just reset, have a sip of water, you know, when you start kind of getting into it a little bit. But
when you know, when you it should be like automatic, you know, to think about where to place the fly and have the fish meet the fly at the right spot. And I kept casting to the fish and not to where the fish was going. Yeah. And then you talk to, you know, you're like, all right, it's like bird hunting. You know, you want to lead them. I was like, well, I suck at bird hunting too. So,
oh no.
I mean, I'm not horrible. I'm actually better at bird hunting than fly fishing. So I'll get there, but I'm still not great.
Oh, I'm really good at hitting them in the head. And, you know, luckily yesterday morning they were into that. That was really cool in the morning, just to see them, you know, that they hear that fly hit the water, and then they're looking, which, I don't know. I always think it's really cool. And, you know, I think, and you can maybe speak to it if you agree, but like, you kind of see where you listen to a lot of these fly fishermen, and they kind of get, I think, a little romantic when they start talking about redfish, and you kind of see how intimate it gets, and you kind of, I think maybe you saw a little bit why we all get a little.
I get it. I mean, I don't think I fully am there yet, but you know, I love bow hunting and being intimate with the environment associated with bow hunting, and you know, for me it's fairly similar, and so I understand it completely from that viewpoint. And I think it's great to romanticize the experience, because that's how it really reaches you, and you know, that goes back to the very beginning of our conversation and my romantic view of fishing in a bay system, you know, when I was 7, and how that may have affected my life. So, you know, that holds true in a lot of different things.
Yeah. Well, sweet, man. Definitely, if you find yourself down here again, and you want to go out, just let me know, and I'll throw you back up there.
I'm here a lot, so
Yeah,
be careful what you wish for.
we'll get back out. And I know right now, if you're out for it, hopefully maybe 6 months or a year, I'd like to sit down again and kind of do an update with how things are going, oyster wise, CC, any new conservation stuff that comes up. If you're up for it,
And just like summertime would be great. Yeah.
and then sorry.
No, I was gonna say like, what's the January?
Yeah.
6-7 months would be great on that subject specifically.
Yeah. And then for anybody listening, what would be some good, I know CCA just came out with a big oyster resource. What would be some other good resources if they want to look into more or if they want to follow along? I know you and myself and I think CCA Texas, BHA Texas, and Flatsworthy, all 5 of us post pretty regularly updates with what's going on with the oyster harvest on Instagram.
Yeah.
And if there's any, can you think of any other like good resources?
Yeah. Well, follow if you're on Instagram, any of those that you mentioned, and or all of them really. Follow all of them because you might get a different viewpoint of the issue. I mean, we're all going in the same direction, but the if you're, like I said, if you're not a member of Flatsworthy or BHA or CCA Texas, it's probably worth your while to become one,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll stay up to date. But of course, always we're putting stuff out on Facebook, and then our website, like you mentioned, we just publicly released this oyster resource page that has a lot of memes, not a lot, but like 6 or 7 memes, and we'll post a video on there, and then we have a ton of other information on there, cited literature and things like that associated with those ecosystem services and oyster resources. So that's on our ccatexas.org/oysters.
Okay. And then talk about your podcast. Let's just touch on it real quick.
Okay.
So people can check it out.
Yeah, Coastal Advocacy Adventures podcast, and I've been doing it since 2016, but it's sporadic. I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not. Haven't been good at like every Tuesday releasing one.
Yeah.
Anyways, I think I'm on 46, so 47, somewhere in there episodes, and so I mean it's on most podcast apps, but we talk about fisheries issues. Sometimes it's random topics, and it'll be more like an interview with an interesting person, and I think it's a good listen, especially if you want to just drill down into a specific issue that's associated with the coast. Most of the time, we have podcast episodes on those things, and then also if there's something that you think is important. Like you're a CCA member, like, hey, dude, why aren't y'all talking about this? Then, hit me up, and I'll try to find the right people and have that conversation.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. So I'm gonna leave some links down below, so you guys listening in can find that stuff really easily, and then go. If you're not, like Shane said, if you're not already, go follow them on Instagram. Follow CCA Texas on Instagram and Flatsworthy, and if you could, for me, hit subscribe, hit like, leave a review on Apple or Spotify. It helps me out, be able to do more stuff like this, bring you guys more conservation, more adventures, more all the stuff that I'm doing. I definitely would really appreciate it. And see you guys next time. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you.